body and my connections to lots of bodies here and elsewhere. Thank you.
Good morning. Is that good? Yes. Until very recently, I lived in Houston, Texas, and this is my first trip back in over a year, so it's good to be back home. There are approximately 3 million Muslims in the United States, a somewhat controversial and unofficial estimate, since the U.S. Census does not count the population by religious affiliation. American Muslims, like every other religious group in the country, are a diverse group. They follow a variety of Islamic traditions. They are Sunni, Shia, Ismaili, Ahmadi, or they follow homegrown American Islams, such as the Nation of Islam. American Muslims are also racially and ethnically diverse. They are African American, of South Asian, Southeast Asian, Arab, and West African descent, and an increasing number of American Muslims identify as Latino or white. Until September 11, 2001, American Muslims lived in relative obscurity, largely escaping notice from historians, sociologists, and policymakers. The advent of the War on Terror catapulted American Muslims into the public eye. The election of Barack Obama in 2008 further spurred interest in and the notoriety of American Muslims. Obama's middle name, Hussein, his Kenyan father, and his childhood spent partly in the majority Muslim nation of Indonesia, fueled speculation that Obama himself was a secret Muslim. Despite the long history of Islam in the United States, and despite the enormous diversity of Islamic beliefs and practices in this country, both 9/11 and Obama's election have proved to be focal points for often vicious critiques of Islam. Islam and Christianity arrived on the North American continent at the same time. Christopher Columbus's crew included conversos, that is, Muslims and Jews who had been coerced into converting to Christianity. Early in the 16th century, enslaved Muslims accompanied conquistadors in their entradas. Estebanico was an enslaved North African from Azamor in Morocco who accompanied Panfilo de Narvaez's entrada into Florida. Estebanico's captors might not have thought of him as Muslim and likely forced him to convert to Christianity after his capture, when he would have acquired his new name, which is Stephen in English. Between 1527 and 1536, Estebanico and 3 other Spanish survivors of Narvaez's expedition walked from present-day Texas, from Galveston actually, to the Pacific coast of Mexico. Estebanico was no stranger to cultural fluidity. His remarkable linguistic abilities helped pilot the survivors of Narvaez's expedition across North America. In 1539, Estebanico accompanied another entrada into the American Southwest, using his knowledge of native cultures, languages, and diplomatic customs to help guide Spanish conquistadores. He was killed near Sonora in 1540. Did Estebanico identify as Muslim? It's a question that is impossible to answer. But Spanish officials were suspicious of Muslim converts to Christianity, forced or otherwise. Technically, the New World was off-limit to conversos, who were barred from making the journey. Yet Estebanico's presence in the Americas suggests that this was a rule honored in the breach. The Spanish continued to use enslaved African Muslims as key parts of their colonization schemes. The settlement at St. Augustine contained many enslaved Muslims in the late 16th century. In other words, there were enslaved Muslims in North America long before permanent English settlement began at Jamestown in 1607. Most Muslims who came to the Americas before 1850 arrived as Estebanico did, as enslaved people mostly from West and West Central Africa, but also occasionally from North Africa. Most historians have not attempted to come up with a demographic analysis, though Sylviane Diouf thought, reasonably, that of the 12.5 million enslaved people brought to the Americas from West Africa, at least several 100,000 were likely Muslim. Many enslaved people arriving in North America would have been familiar with Islam even if they did not identify as Muslims themselves. Michael Gomez has noted that around 50% of enslaved people coming to mainland North America came from those areas of West Africa where Islam was either state-sponsored or associated with a culturally significant minority, reflecting the cosmopolitan religious lives of West Africans who combined Christianity, Islam, and traditional West African practice in novel, syncretic ways. The general problem is that enslaved Muslims were even a more invisible minority within the invisible institution of slave religion. As Edward Curtis has noted, quote, when whites observed African American Muslim rituals, they often did not understand what was taking place right in front of their eyes. Nevertheless, Sylviane Diouf has pressed historians to recognize that enslaved Muslims were everywhere, and that, quote, Islam was indeed a diasporic religion. Though the lives of enslaved Muslims remain opaque, scholars know a great deal about a few specific individuals. In 1788, soldiers from another ethnic group captured Abd al-Rahman Ibrahima and sold him to European slave traders. Abd al-Rahman lived as an enslaved man in New Orleans for decades, marrying an African-American Baptist woman named Isabella, before writing a letter in Arabic in 1826 asking for his freedom. Abd al-Rahman toured the United States, raising money to buy freedom for himself and his children. Newspapers around the country chronicled his travels and his life story. Colonization enthusiasts, that is, white Americans who wanted to emancipate black people and repatriate them to West Africa. Colonization enthusiasts hoped that Abd al-Rahman, who was celebrated as, quote, a Moorish prince, would aid them in establishing diplomatic ties between the infant colony of freed people in Liberia and nearby African kingdoms, as well as helping convert West Africans to Christianity. In 1829, he journeyed to Liberia with his wife, though he was unable to fulfill the hopes of his captors and sponsors in the United States. He died shortly after his arrival there. We know about Abd al-Rahman in part because he was literate and also was able to advocate for himself and his family, using American ideas about Islam and Muslims to get what he wanted. Most enslaved Muslims were not so lucky. Similarly, Yaro Mahmoud, an educated West African who was enslaved in 1752, gained his freedom after 45 years as a slave to a Maryland family. He moved to Washington, D.C., where he owned property until his death in 1823. And interestingly, there's some archaeological investigation going on at that property in D.C. now. Yaro and Abd al-Rahman had compelling biographies that often stand in for the stories of enslaved Muslims. But the fact remains that most enslaved Muslims were either not literate or did not otherwise have the means to make their stories known. Most enslaved Muslims worked to keep their faith intact, even in the face of persecution, passing on their names, rituals, including prayer mats and beads, and prayers to their descendants. Retaining Islam as enslaved people in a new world was a form of resistance and of self-preservation. While the biographies of individuals like Abd al-Rahman and Yaro Mahmoud suggest how enslaved Muslims lived, the devotion of most of these people went unrecognized and unremembered by the Americans who owned them. The numbers of enslaved Muslims in the United States probably rose in the last decade before the close of the transatlantic slave trade. The Sudanese Jihad, which swept across Africa in a wide belt from east to west, caught many African Muslims in its net who were enslaved and shipped to the United States, which had drastically increased importations of enslaved people in anticipation of the closing of the trade in 1808. Sometimes these enslaved Muslims were even apparent to otherwise blind white Americans. Writing in 1842, Presbyterian clergyman Charles Colcock Jones noted that, quote, the Mohammedan Africans remaining of the old stock of importations, although accustomed to hear the gospel preached, have been known to accommodate Christianity to Mohammedanism. God, they say, is Allah, and Jesus Christ is Muhammad. Their religion is the same, but different countries have different names. Jones's observation signal, I think, some discomfort with African American spirituality. Despite the visibility of African Muslims such as Abd al-Rahman and Yaro Mahmoud, most enslaved Muslims remained invisible to their captors. This, I think, was the beginning of an erasure. The presence of enslaved Muslims was opaque to their captors and thus remains largely opaque to historians. refusal to recognize this part of the African Muslim past contributes to an ideology in which Islam is foreign to the United States. If Americans did not learn about Islam from their enslaved property, they did learn about it through other means. European Christians and North African and Ottoman Muslims came into extended contact with one another in the context of warfare, violence, piracy, enslavement, and travel. The English privateer and adventurer Francis Drake carried some enslaved Turks away with him after his siege of Cartagena de Indias in 1586. Turk, we should understand here, was an all-purpose English descriptor of any Muslim person from North Africa or the Ottoman East. It was a very broad descriptor and doesn't necessarily mean somebody from present-day Turkey. One of these men, a Turk named Chinano, converted to Christianity before the English sent him back to Constantinople, where they hoped that he would facilitate any number of conversions from Islam to Christianity. Their hopes were unfounded. Englishmen saw Islam as a threat and as a competitor for one simple reason. English sailors, merchants, mercenaries, and travelers in the Mediterranean were under constant risk of being captured, enslaved, and converted to Islam. An estimated 1 million Europeans were enslaved between 1400 and 1800 in North Africa and the Ottoman Empire. And some of these people, mostly men, converted to Islam in order to gain their freedom. Others hoped that relatives would ransom them. They wrote letters to family and charitable organizations in England, often at the insistence of their owners, in hopes of redemption. North African piracy threatened American shores as well. In 1690, Virginia resident Daniel Tyler was reported, quote, unhappily taken by the Turks and carried to Algiers, and hath not for at least 7 years past been heard of, so that he is esteemed dead. And this was an action to allow his widow to probate his estate and then remarry. The famous English mercenary and adventurer John Smith fought the Ottomans in Eastern Europe in the early 17th century and was taken as a prisoner of war and enslaved at the Battle of Rotentan in 1602. Smith reported that his master ordered other slaves to, quote, strip him naked and shave his head and beard as bare as his hand. A great ring of iron with a long stalk bowed like a sickle was riveted round his neck. Smith famously wrote in the third person. Eventually, Smith escaped after he, quote, beat out his master's brains with a threshing bat. Despite this experience, Smith had little to say specifically about Islam or Muslims. After his escape, Smith traveled extensively as a free man throughout the North African states, observing the wealth and power of these princely states and noting that the, quote, countries of Fez and Morocco are the best part of all Barbary, abounding with people, they eat well and have all good necessities for man's use. William Strachey, another Virginia colonist, drew on his experience as a clerk for the Levant Company in Constantinople to draw comparisons between Ottoman Muslims and native North Americans. Some of Strachey's observations were relatively neutral. He noted, quote, the Indians' drink is, as the Turks, clear water, and, quote, the Indians spread a mat, as the Turks do a carpet, for them to sit upon. Strachey's comparisons were less sanguine when discussing Indians' marital habits. Strachey wrote that Wahunsonacock, the paramount chief of Tidewater, Virginia, we know him as Powhatan, followed a polygamous practice, but did not keep all of his wives, quote, as the Turk in one seraglio or house. He also theorized that these, quote, sensual helps, as the Turks, weakened the Indian's body politic. Strachey used other comparisons as well, describing a game young Indian boys played as similar to one described in Virgil. Islam was more than merely another point of reference for him. Strachey's experience of Islam in the Ottoman Empire was both an idiom for comprehending the strangeness and foreignness of native people, as well as a way of expressing disdain for native customs that the English knew primarily from Muslim countries, such as polygamy. Islam operated in English discourses about the New World generally as a point of negative comparison. Between the 17th and 19th centuries, the Islamic world occupied a key place in Anglo-American polemics against political tyranny, seemingly senseless violence, slavery, and other questionable practices. Timothy Marr has called this rhetorical practice, evidenced both in Smith's and Strachey's writings, Islamicism. That is, an Orientalism that both described the, quote, untractable difference of Islam while simultaneously upholding Anglo-American identity. The identification of political violence and tyranny with Islamic practice generally and Muslim peoples in particular is thus a centuries-long rhetorical tradition. To call a political opponent Turkish was to intimate both tyranny and senseless violence. Likewise, in the late 18th and 19th centuries, American ideas about Islam became important with the emergence of the Latter-day Saints, who for some decades allowed polygamous marriages. Americans opposed to Mormonism likened the Latter-day Saints Church to Islam and Joseph Smith to Muhammad. These commenters linked a vision of politically tyrannical Islam to an emergent idea of Islam that was also tyrannical in the home, especially to women. Wrote one commentator, quote, "Turkey is in our midst. Modern Mohammedanism has its Mecca at Salt Lake, where the prophet speaks of his wives as cows. Clearly, the Quran was Joseph Smith's model so closely followed as to exclude even the poor pretension of originality in his foul revelations." And there are many, many, many other commentators who are writing similar things, linking the emerging religion of the Latter-day Saints with what Americans thought Islam to be. The idea that Islam, and by extension Mormonism, devalued women reverberates even into contemporary discourses about the Islamic world and the place of women in it. Both the conservative Christian evangelist Franklin Graham and liberal political commentator Bill Maher have used American notions about the status of women in majority Muslim countries to fuel Islamophobic rhetoric. And I can talk more about this in the Q&A. This is the part that I had to cut to stay close to the 15-minute mark. American Islamicism was thus a complicated interplay of actual human experiences of the Muslim other, accompanied by rumor, stereotypes, and the ever-present threat of violence. While Americans had difficulty seeing enslaved Muslims in their midst, they had and continue to have no such trouble understanding Islam as inherently tyrannical and misogynistic. Titling this talk, Barack Hussein Obama, America's first Muslim president, plays in a satirical way on the ways in which Americans doubt the president's religious affiliation and used his supposed Muslimness to demonstrate his un-Americanness. Barack Obama thus became, however unwittingly, a focal point of Islamophobic commentary in the United States. This is a discourse that denies the actual existence and complex histories of American Muslims, but engages long-standing Islamicist discourses that originated in the 15th and 16th centuries. This kind of rhetoric has a long history, and as we have seen, it has also had the effect of marginalizing and othering American Muslims. Thank you.